All right, welcome everybody to episode 15 of the podcast for another author panel. And as a city lover, this is a topic that I've been so excited to do ever since I started the podcast last year. We're going to be talking about cities as characters. I have a fantastic group of panelists joining me today, all making first appearances. And together we're going to delve deeper into the heart of the urban sprawl. So first up is Fonda Lee. She's the world fantasy and three-time Aurora Award-winning author of the Green Bone Saga, including Jade City, Jade War, and Jade Legacy, which just came out back in November, December, as well as Zeroboxer and the EXO series. So good to see you, Fonda. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Adrian.
Pleasure. Very good to see you again. And next up is Gareth Hanrahan. He's a writer and game designer, best known for his Black Iron Legacy series, including The Gutter Prayer, The Shadow Saint, and The Broken God. Gareth has also published a ton of role-playing games and supplements, including the award-winning The Laundry Files RPG, Adventures in Middle Earth, and The Dracula Dossier. So welcome to the show, Gareth.
Happy to be here. I'm semi-awake, so it's always a plus.
Post-birthday party blues. It's okay, buddy.
Post-birthday party crush, indeed.
And also joining us is Jadie Jang. She's the author of Monkey Around, her debut novel. So first of all, I want to congratulate you on that. And she is also a cultural worker and activist and co-founded Hyphen Magazine, the Aperture Festival in San Francisco, and the disability justice organization Bad Crip. So happy to have you here, Jadie.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And last up, my good friend, my rock, Peter Hartog. He is the author of Bloodlines and Pieces of Eight, books 1 and 2 in his Guardian of the Empire City series, and he's currently hard at work on book number 3. So I'm so glad to finally have you on the show, my friend. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. Just being with these wonderful authors and hanging out with you. I'm just so excited. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure, buddy. It's a pleasure. It's about time, right?
Yeah. You don't. The show was doing really well, and then you brought me on. But hey, that's okay.
We're tanking from here.
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh man. So I really love cities as a setting, as a place to visit in real life. But to start off the discussion, I want to know what appeals to each of you about cities. So we'll kick it off with you, Fonda.
Well, I have always loved cities as a setting. I think one of the things that appeals to me most about them is that they are the greatest concentration of humanity in terms of the cross section of people that you can encounter in cities. I mean, they really are this stew of just every socioeconomic demographic, different types of people, different races. You have they're often a focal point for migration and immigrants coming into a new land, and so you really do get like this enormous diversity of types of people and their backgrounds and their social status and occupation and all that, like in one concentrated place. And so for a fictional city, if you want to tell a story in which you are highlighting tensions in society and interactions between different elements of the population, cities are this fantastic place to do that, because you really do get like the absolute richest, billionaire types who are walking by homeless people, right? So you get so many potential friction points, and yet all these different elements are coexisting, and there's a lot of just narrative potential to mine with that setting.
Yeah, I agree. And Peter, what about you? What appeals to you about cities?
It's the old expression, the melting pot. In New York City, any other city, just like Fonda was saying, it's a confluence of energy. The cultures, the religions, the ethnicities, all of those bits and pieces that form a very chaotic yet surprisingly cohesive whole. People migrate towards cities, whether it's because they're looking to discover their dreams, or that's where their families have been for generations. And whether you're established or whether you're a newcomer, the possibility, the optimism, the opportunity, that's some of the characteristics that I find fascinating about cities: the revolution and evolution of technology, and yet sometimes underneath all that, the dark side of humanity, the good and the bad, that is rife with potential for storytelling.
Yeah, it's like humanity's full spectrum of capability all smashed into this very concentrated core. JD, what about you? What's your take on cities and what appeals to you?
I think it comes down to cities are, depending on what metaphor you like, they're machines or they're organisms, and they function in particular ways. They're not just a large collection of people. Um, although if you collect a large enough number of people and into one place for long enough, they will eventually organize into a city. But cities function in particular ways that smaller towns and villages and ex-urban places don't function. And they have different centers of different kinds of activities. They have different loci, different places of concentration. They have different layers. And there's so many different functions that happen within a city, and it all kind of fits together in various ways. And every city, the ways that it fits together are different. And I find myself a little bit incoherent about this because it's so vast. I've sort of been studying urbanism as an amateur for many years because there are just so many ways of looking at a city and sort of peeling away the layers of the onion and understanding how it works. But I'll stop there because I don't think I quite encapsulated what it is that I find fabulous about cities, but hopefully that'll come out later.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into it. You brought up an interesting point. I mean, first of all, you just by everything that you said conveyed the fact that you are fascinated by cities. There's something unique about it to the point where you dub yourself an amateur urbanist. And I find that absolutely amazing because we as humans tend to gravitate towards our interests, and a lot of the time we become really obsessive about it. And if you're fascinated by cities so much that you write about them, I think the research and everything that you dig up on cities that actually exist in our own world, that just comes naturally, and I can hear the passion in your voice. So I really appreciate that, and I connect with you on that level. Gareth, we'll get your take on what appeals to you about cities, and then I want to dig into what can define the character of a city and what can make a city so special. So, Gareth, if you wanna take off on both of those topics.
In terms of what I like about cities, what really appeals is sort of the messiness of them. That you can walk down the street, turn a corner, and have a totally different plot element. Wherever you go, there's all sorts of hidden nooks and crannies and different factions and groups, and it all overlaps so nicely, so that you've got just huge opportunities for making stuff up, and for if you're ever sort of stuck, you can bring something new in. It's a great environment for messy storytelling. What was the next question again? This is the birthday party we're in.
It's all good. What for you because JD brought up every city is so unique that you're peeling back the layers, but this onion is different from that onion. This city is different from that city. But what for you can impact what the character of a city is like, or what makes a particular city so special?
I think every city is going to have certain commonalities in terms of different neighborhoods and districts. In a fantasy book or series, every city is going to have a docks, or there's going to be a rich area, poor area. It's the sort of the quirks that make this city unique. That the particular industries, particular sort of folds of its history, and it all sort of builds up. No city has sort of one defining element. It's always sort of the sort of overlap of 3 or 4 or 5 different things that make it different and unique to multiple points of friction.
Yeah, like the melting pot is so
Yeah, melting
uh,
pot is so much of a metaphor.
it's once everything is in that pot, it's sometimes difficult to define the individual ingredients because the flavor of that of that pot is unique because of all the different elements that come together and combine and interweave in such a way that the unique end result uh is the thing that appeals to people. But obviously for every individual person, as we were saying before we started recording, Toronto's different for me as it is for Fonda. But that's because my melting pot version of Toronto tastes different than Fonda's. But Fonda, do you want to get in on this and sort
Yeah.
of
I mean, I think
elaborate
that
on? Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I think so you asked what are some things that can really define a city and give it its unique characteristics. And
Hmm.
I think first and foremost, geography and climate are really, really crucial to the formation of a city and what its character is. Because if you think about where any city is formed, why did people decide to settle there? Why did they decide that this place was the place where they're going to set up permanent residence? And it's often maybe it's at the junction of two rivers. Maybe it's because of um, a sheltered harbor that was good for trade. Maybe it was a defensible area from enemies. So there's so many reasons why a city is, and sometimes they're political, right? Like an emperor decided to move the capital here. So there are reasons, geographic and climate related reasons why people decide to settle in place, and that really becomes part of that city's DNA. So for example, I lived in Toronto for many years, and I was working downtown, and my memories of Toronto involve a lot of time navigating the subway and the underground mall when it was freezing cold and the city was covered in snow and ice. And
Yeah.
that is a very different experience and a character to that city than, say, Los Angeles, which is this huge, sprawling, sun-drenched, a place filled with traffic that would be. I mean, if that place was covered in snow, it would be impossible, massively costly to try and maintain all of those freeways in a blizzard. And then, I now live in the Pacific Northwest, and I think there's something to be said for the climate of this city contributing to me becoming a writer and the amount of rainy days that I spend indoors making up other worlds. So there's a large part of that city's character that is very much defined by its physicality.
Hmm. Well, thank you, Overcast Oregon, for urging Fonda to write. Peter,
It's
what's
true.
your
There's
take?
something in the water. We have you can't throw a rock without hitting a writer around here, I think.
The dreary days make people uh, insular and creative. And Peter, what about you? What's your take on all this?
I'm basically moving to the Pacific Northwest and Oregon because if it's in the water, then I need to drink as much of it as possible to just get that creativity going. But the essence of a city is its bones. The character that's developed by the people that dwell there from the beginning all the way up to wherever it is now. And I've lived in the Northeast. I'm originally from Massachusetts. So Boston is home for me. And then I moved down to Georgia, which is the deep South. And so I have Atlanta, which is considered a northern city in the deep South. And, some of it has to do with just the availability of the land, of how much can you actually build, whether it's a sprawl versus a collection on top of a fen, say like in the case of parts of Boston, or, reclamation of land from water. And so those bones, which are the ultimate foundation for that city, infused with the character of the people that started there, and what, for good or for bad, whether you're how influenced it was by the reasons why the people were there and what they were trying to do, and then what has come since then. So cities are fascinating and have always been fascinating to me because I grew up in a small town, Ashland, Massachusetts. Got to represent that. I've looked at cities. I've lived in Pittsburgh. I've lived in around Atlanta and Boston, and I've visited New York and San Francisco, LA, and whatever for business. They're all different. They're all unique, from the architecture, the food, the smells, the sight, the way how strong the sun is, like in Los Angeles, versus kind of the gloom in New England, or down in the South, the oppressive heat. And those parts lend themselves additionally to the character of the city. You think Atlanta, you think hot. You think of LA, you think sprawl. You think New York, you think skyscrapers and a wealth of people. And Pittsburgh, you think bridges. You may not think that, but that is actually what you think. Confluence of rivers. So
that is what you think. You have no choice.
Yes, you have no choice. I have said so, therefore it is true. No, I have no idea what I'm talking about. But all of those bits and pieces, like I said earlier, they define parts of the city, and the dark places, the around the corners, like Gareth was saying. You turn the corner and poof, messy story, which I think is a brilliant way of looking at it. And it's true. You just don't know what you're going to get.
It's like the city itself is an endless stream of writing prompts. You turn a corner, you never know what's going to happen. Shit gets messy. Things go well, things go bad. You never know. Jadie, what about you? For you, what are some aspects of cities that can define its character?
Well, I won't even jump off what has already been said, because it was said thoroughly. I think industry is a really important one, and not just the kind of industry, because that, as Fonda pointed out, was determined by geography to a great extent, but how industry moves through a city. Like, for example, San Francisco was founded as a boom town, and there's something about San Francisco that has kept it a boom town. And every generation, there is a new boom with a new industry that comes in, floods the city like a tide, and then like a tide goes back out. And then a bunch of people leave the city, and then another industry comes in and floods the city, and like a tide, it comes back out. And San Francisco's character has been determined by these boom and bust cycles. And you don't see that in other cities. Other cities are much more stable than San Francisco. And so this kind of instability has built the character, the population instability, the industrial instability, the financial instability has built the character of the city. And other cities who have a certain kind of staid stability, stability isn't necessarily staid, but the stability can cause a staidness or a staleness, or the stability can cause an incredible growth or flowering. It really depends. So like I said, all of these things are interlocked. It's really hard to pick these things apart. Another thing is certain traditions grow up, and the moment people become conscious of them and start holding on to them and upholding them, the traditions of a city become really important to its character. And again, San Francisco is always going to be my example, because this is the city I've lived in the longest. But we have a tradition of political protest, and so this city, the entire world looks on us as a kind of bubble of liberalism. I don't know how actually true that is. We're not always as liberal or left as people think we are, but we definitely do have a tradition of a certain kind of activism, a certain kind of, being on the bleeding edge of political thought and political action in kind of civic action in particular. And you know what? I'm not even going to go on. There's so many other ways so many other aspects of cities that make them particular. And if I continue talking, I'm just going to take up the whole time, so I'll stop.
No, it's okay, Jadie. You made a couple points that really stand stand out to me, and everyone kind of like, I'm gonna bring this all together and sort of lead it into the next question. I want to know if you have a particular example of a city that stands out. And Jadie, you spoke so um, intensely about San Francisco and what it goes through with these boom and bust cycles. And for me, living in Quito in Ecuador, it's just this very strange amalgamation of history and culture as a part of the Inca Empire, and then as it progressed through the Spanish conquistadors and all that. And now that it's kind of taken on more modernist tones, and how all of that intermingles in very strange ways. Quito doesn't necessarily have like a strong industry the way that somewhere like San Francisco does with all its ebbs and flows, but culturally there's still so much that's really emblematic about the city. There's like San Francisco, a history of protest and um, sort of like public civic demonstrations of especially indigenous versus I guess you could call it institutional forces. So a lot of times the indigenous people, who are usually the ones who are outside of the city in the farms and providing a lot of the sustenance for the people who are living in the city, they get treated like shit. And when things go awry from a government perspective, it is South America, and so there are a ton of ebbs and flows in terms of government stability, as opposed to industry. The indigenous people, they take to the streets, and a lot of the times they actually march from their small towns to Quito in order to display their disagreement with the government and their mistreatment of the indigenous population. So it's like all these different things coming together. It's like the city as a focal point of culture and history, government and politics, industry, in the sense that these are farmers who are coming here to voice their opinions against the government. All these different things coming together in such fascinating ways. And Fonda, you brought up geography. Quito to me is so distinct because it runs through like a narrow channel of a valley in between these two uh, massive rises of Andean mountains. And so the urban sprawl of this city is literally just smeared straight down from top to bottom. And there's a little bit of sort of like pockets of population on the outskirts. But if you look on a map, it's just, I mean, I guess I could make a Robert Jordan reference. It's like Tarvalon, and it's shaped like a vagina. But that's just a matter of geography playing into it. It's like this is a valley in between a ton of active volcanoes, and the city has just spread up and down based on its geographical situation. So many things that make the city really unique, and I think more than, other than Berlin, where I lived for 3 years, um, you know, so much combining of different unique aspects of a country and a people and different groups coming together with Spanish influence, Inca influence, modern influence, a lot of it coming from the United States, and all of it just smashing together in this chaos of a city. And I absolutely love it. So I'll toss this over to Fonda. If you have an example of a city that you really connected with, you really
Gosh.
love, and why.
You know, I don't know if I can answer the question as like, what's a city that has really connected with me and that I love, because I've found something to appreciate about every one of the cities that I've lived in, including Toronto, which I know is not your favorite city, but I've spent the longest amount of time. I've lived in Toronto, Calgary, Bay Area, and then I live now in Portland, Oregon. But because I've lived the longest here in Portland, I will answer your question in sort of in terms of like what has been really sort of distinctive or interesting about the place that I live in now, um, and it ties into sort of this into the storytelling aspect, because I think there are cities that stand out for sort of the narrative that they build up around themselves, right? Like, what do people who live there tell themselves about their city? And this, I think, is, for me, it has been the strongest with living here in Portland, because Portland is a city that is very aggressively, almost self-consciously quirky and counterculture. I mean, we have bumper stickers that say, like, keep Portland weird, right? And the narrative that is built up around Portland, which is not a big city, is such that, depending on who I talk to, if I say something like, oh, I live in Portland, Oregon, I may get a response like, oh, wow, I love Portland. And because there's this, they're thinking like, oh, like food trucks, and we're all just like quirky hipsters wearing Birkenstocks and like brewing kombucha and like shopping at the farmer's market. Or I'll get a response like, oh goodness, like, because they'll be thinking like riots and like burning trash cans and like the city just being filled with political protests, day and night, and the whole city is burning, right? Because that was the narrative that was around Portland for a good chunk of, the last few years. So that is interesting in and of itself, but yet there's the question of, to what extent is that narrative accurate, or does it portray sort of the daily experience of the people who live there? And like, for me, it is always interesting to see the reactions of people to, the idea of Portland, when I live sort of in a Western burb area of Portland that's filled with tech companies and like people who go, drive their kids to school and go about their daily lives. And so neither of those extremes of this just being anarchy or like, happy communist, people growing food in their backyard and hand knitting, like making handicrafts. Like, neither of those is accurate. And I think that can be applied to a lot of cities that have this character that has kind of grown up out of sort of a shared mythos, right? Like, you think of New York, which has this mythos of being the land of opportunity and where like all immigrants came to. But like, is that really real now? Like, is it the land of opportunity for a lot of the people there? And what does that jive with their day-to-day experience? So yeah, I think that's an interesting thing to think about, is that what does a city tell itself that it is, and how does that influence how other people see that city if they haven't lived in it for themselves?
Yeah, I like that notion, the sense of a lived narrative versus a more shared popular narrative of what a city. And things like movies, I think, especially in the United States, movies kind of fuck with people's idea of what a city actually is, and then you go and visit it and you realize, oh yeah, this is not as glamorous or characteristic as I imagined it based on the movies or TV shows that I've seen,
Right.
etc.
And I mean, to watch American movies, you would think that the only things that happen in the US happen in like the US or Los Angeles. I mean, New York or Los Angeles, right? Like, those are
Exactly.
like the main cities where any story takes place. And that also speaks to where are kind of concentrations of industry and power. And like, I'm as an author, so much of the perspective of the publishing industry is based in New York. And
Yeah.
for the entertainment industry, so much of that perspective is based in Los Angeles.
Yeah. And so it's skewed right off the bat. It's like, this is the collective narrative that Los Angeles is speaking, but it's also portraying places beyond Los Angeles, or in the case of books, it's like the publishing industry is projecting many, many narratives about many places, but all within this central locus of publishing power within Manhattan and what have you. Yeah. Gareth, we'll get your take on a real life city that you have visited or lived in and you've really connected with.
Yeah, I mean, the only place I really lived for any time has been like here in Cork in Ireland, where I was born and have lived for like 95% of my life. Thinking of places I visited and how they interact. it's interesting that how you're introduced to a city will sort of so much shade your impressions of it. Like, I lived in Oslo for a couple of months working on a computer game, and all my associations there are very sort of cold. Well, obviously, Norway cold, but the city, because I was like, they're doing a job and didn't have that much in the way of like, socialization or anything, friends, they're on my own. That Oslo, to me, still, it's very sort of like, unfriendly, not unfriendly, but like sort of like, unwelcoming and hard to know place. Whereas I was in Wellington, New Zealand for like 3 or 4 days maybe. But because I was staying with friends and they showed me around, showed me all the sort of local bits and like, this little side street, little bookstore there. In my head, it is this incredibly welcoming, quirky, lived-in city where I would like, move to in a heartbeat. And certainly also like when writing, you have two characters walking to the same street in the same city, and their personality and their perceptions of the city would colour so much of the narrative that you would almost see like two different cities.
Mm-hmm. That's something that we will get into, sort of how multiple POVs can allow you to portray different levels, different strata of a city, and give you sort of different perspectives such that it fleshes out the city a little bit more piece by piece. But first, Jadie, we'll get your take on a city that, it doesn't have to be San Francisco, that you visited or lived in, that you really connected with.
Not San Francisco. Like you, Adrian, I lived in Berlin for 5 years during my 20s. And it wasn't just during my 20s, which are the opening out years. It was also during the period immediately after reunification in the 90s. So I was experiencing this opening out, and Berlin was experiencing this opening out, and it was an amazing time to be there. And that was living in Berlin was what got me fascinated with urbanism, because the whole time I was living there, Berlin was a huge construction site. The face of the city, the infrastructure, the structures, everything was changing day by day. And I would walk outside my door and walk a few blocks or take a train, and I'd find like literally the streets reforming around me and the buildings reforming around me. It was being in the middle of like this tremendous transformation. When I visit Berlin now, I don't recognize huge chunks of the city. But the one thing that really got me was the reason I fell in love with it was I was reading my guidebook, and it said go to Potsdamer Platz, which is the center of the city. So I took the underground there, and I came up from underground up a staircase into this ginormous empty lot. It was just a complete hole right in the middle of one of Europe's major cities, and I was like, this is fucked. I love it. It's amazing.
Yeah.
And of course, now if you go to Potsdamer Platz, it's the most built up area of the city, and it's completely new, and it's just high rises and shiny glass.
It's steel and glass
everywhere. Yeah. But when I first appeared in Potsdamer Platz, it was the world's biggest empty lot right smack in the middle of the city. And as I lived there, I watched the traffic around Potsdamer Platz change and shift like a river system that's had a big rock or like a volcanic extrusion just kind of extruded up into it, and everything just kind of shifts around it. There's so many geological metaphors for geography, especially in a place like Berlin. But that was the first thing. The second thing was finding your way around Berlin in the 90s was a nightmare because they kept changing the street names. And it wasn't like in the United States where they only changed the names of major streets because they're hugely symbolic, and the major streets are hugely symbolic. So you got to make sure like a major street isn't like in San Francisco, a major street isn't named Army. You want to name it Cesar Chavez or rename it Cesar Chavez. In Berlin, every street, like there's no Elm Street or Birch Street or anything like that. There's like, you know, there's streets named after poets, there's streets named after politicians, there's streets named after, I mean, just like I lived on a street, like a 2-block long street that was named after a Polish poet. And so all of those had to be changed. And this was, when I was there in the 90s, this was the 5th wave of massive street renamings in the 20th century. Because every time there's a regime change, like a major regime change in Berlin, they have to change a larger and larger swath of street names. So the maps that everybody used to get around Berlin had a little yellow booklet in the front, which just listed the street renamings, and you had to get a new map every year because they would rename more and more and more streets. And it was like hundreds and hundreds of streets being renamed. And there were so many, and as more I got into this and started talking to taxi drivers about it, there are a million stories about streets being renamed. One of the taxi drivers' favorites is there was a little old lady who was infamous among taxi drivers who would get into a cab and say, "Take me to Adolf Hitler Platz." And none of the cab drivers knew where Adolf Hitler Platz was because it was only called Adolf Hitler Platz for 12 years. And then very quickly it was like the first thing that was renamed. So so they would have to call the dispatch, and the dispatch would be like, "Yeah, we know this woman. Here, it's Theodor Heusplatz." But she would do it just to fuck with the cab drivers. So this was what got me into Berlin. These layers of history, like just walking down the street, you know, the geographical and geological layers of history that you could see in the buildings around you. You know, somebody would excavate a building that had been partially bombed out and had never been renovated, and you could just literally see layers of like brick and stone going back 200, 300, 400 years in the foundations of the buildings, and then you can look at this at a map of the city, and you can see where the old walls of the city were in the medieval city, and where the old walls of the city in the Renaissance city were, where the city gates were, and all of this stuff. So more layers.
Damn, Jadie, I'm like, you're bringing back so many memories for me. I love this. You encapsulated Berlin. If you really connect with that city, you encapsulated it with, this is really fucked up, but I love it. Like, if you love Berlin, it's that kind of mentality. Like, this place is a disaster, but it's so cool. And I think that's one of the best examples. You know, Quito has some elements of it too, but, you know, going back to geological references, Berlin is one of those cities that has such clear stratification of its history visible, like really, really visible. I remember when I was living there, there's a big hill to the west of Berlin, and it's surrounded by a forest, and it's called Grunewald. And on top of this hill it was a Soviet, or not a Soviet. It was an Allied radar station, sort of like communication station, built onto the top of this hill. It's abandoned now, but they've sort of reclaimed it and turned it into like an art gallery / art space. But the hill itself, I didn't realize it, but the hill itself did not exist until after World War II. And they took tons and tons of rubble from Berlin and piled it and then planted trees on top of it. And now it just seems like a hill, even though it's literally built on the rubble of a broken city that was devastated during World War II. So it's just the geography itself is a shapeshifter based on the history and the devastation that the city underwent, you know? And then like Jadie, she walked into Potsdamer Platz and it's just like an empty lot. And you're like, this is the most ghetto European capital in existence, but it's so emblematic and so it's so strong-willed in its will to live and persist and shift its shape into something new. This is really cool. Peter, we'll finish off that notion with you. If there's a city, I know Berlin is like so crazy. I could talk for hours about that city, but what's a city that for you really connected with and why?
I would love to visit Berlin. I've only been to Europe once, but I'm going to be a homer for a second, but then I'll shift. Boston is a wonderful city. I'm a very visceral, experiential person. When I go somewhere, I'm breathing in the air. I'm looking around. I'm feeling, is it cold? Is it hot? Is it whatever? And when you wander the streets of Boston, I took my family to Boston last July. My kids had only been up to Massachusetts once. My wife had only been there once, and we walked around the city doing the touristy stuff because it's everywhere you walk. There's history. It's certainly not to the level of Europe, where you're talking hundreds, thousands of years or whatever. But the history, it's a proud history, good and bad. You see the cobblestones, you see some of the older architecture next to the newer gleaming skyscrapers or whatever. But I'm a food guy, so you walk in the north end of Boston and just take in a deep breath. And besides the underlayment of car exhaust, and you've got the harbor and the sea and the sea smell, but it's the food. It's the ambiance. It's the people smiling and talking to each other, and they know each other, or at least the locals do. And the accents, whether it's they've just got off the boat, or they're from Massachusetts forever, and they say things in crazy ways like "ca" and "pack" and things like that, because ours don't exist there.
Your accent comes out sometimes.
It does. I mean, I can continue this with, it's wicked fun to actually talk like that, but I'm not going to do that to you.
That'll be confusing for listeners.
Juxtaposed with that is I got to visit San Francisco, and I was there for doing an audit for one of our offices, and I was in the financial area, the Transamerica building, that neighborhood, and I got out and I just walked around, and I walked up all the hills, or many of them. And that was back when I was in shape and I had hair. That was a long time ago. And I wandered around, and just how quickly some of the neighborhoods changed from, proper financial business to Chinatown and bits of Chinatown. And then I would head toward the waterfront, and you see Ghirardelli, and you see the bridge in the distance, and Jadie, please correct me if I mess up on any of this, because it's been a while. But the difference of West Coast versus East Coast, and how San Francisco has its own history, and you can see some of that, but all of the cultures that have bled into it and really made it its own unique flavor, and its own unique sounds, and its own unique sights, and yet there were similarities to San Francisco and Boston that I really appreciated. Maybe it's because it's on the water as well, and maybe because it's cooler in terms of temperature, as well as culturally too. But those similarities, I felt very much at home walking around San Fran, and really appreciated that and enjoyed that a lot.
Cool. Yeah, I mean that's something that you can kind of a comfort that you can feel, maybe just based on the fact that it's two cities within America, but America is so diverse in and of itself that it's impossible to just boil it down to that. Like, I grew up in British Columbia, and like places like Vancouver, I can feel similar to Portland or San Francisco, but at the same time, each of those cities has something unique to tell to the people that live there, and that's different from what visitors would experience as well. I feel like the cities that I've lived in, I've gotten to have a more nuanced appreciation for what that city has to offer. There are some cities that have very impressionistic just sort of baseline, Berlin being one of them. I think Tokyo is one of those kind of cities. It's just like, whoa, but then other cities, it's like drinking. It's like shotgunning a beer versus drinking a whiskey and taking your time with it. You know, a city that you live in, you take sips and you notice the fine notes, all the different flavors that are suffusing the drink. Whereas, you know, sometimes you just get this really flash, hot in the pan, like Gareth in Wellington, 3-4 days, like boom, this just insanely hot, searing impression of this city based on my short amount of time there. And I think it's really cool to be able to live in a city versus visit a city and get different experiences from that. You know, maybe you fly somewhere and you're jet lagged and it's like, I feel like shit and I had a terrible time in Paris or blah, 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 blah. But for someone who lives in Paris, it's like, you know, years and years and years of accumulated details that really flesh it out. And I want to get deeper into actual writing. And I think a lot of all of you have done in your writing is inhabited your cities with characters who have more nuanced perspectives on the cities that they're living in. Just based on the fact that you are writers and you have the benefit of time to convey exactly what you want to convey with your cities. So Fonda, we'll start with you. I'm curious, why did you decide to choose a city as a setting to begin with? And then building on top of that, how does it play into how you portray things like world building and character and plot?
So, really, for me, the reason why my trilogy is set in a city is because of vibes. Like when I started writing the Green Bone Saga, I didn't have a plot, I didn't have characters, I just had vibes. I just knew what this story would feel like. And I envisioned it as being kind of a modern era fantasy that evoked the like coolest moves in the martial arts movies that I enjoyed, but also a lot of gangster fiction and crime drama movies. And what is that genre without the men smoking in bars and the back alley deals and the assassinations at the docks, and like those are just so much a part of the aesthetic of that genre that I knew right off the bat that this would be a story set in a city, and that the city would play an incredibly important role in the narrative. And my goal right off the start was that the city of Janloon had to be a character in its own right. You had to get to know the city in the same way that you get to know the characters, because it is, even though the trilogy goes off into a bunch of other places and you go to other countries, you go to other cities, and it becomes much more global, it always comes back to the city of Janloon. And in order to make that character, the Uber character of Janloon, feel real, I needed to make it as textural as possible. So I focused a lot on making it feel lived in and making it feel specific, giving names to the districts and the streets, the restaurants, the cars that you see on when you're walking down the sidewalk. All the smells and the sights and all of that had to be part of the story. And you talked about having different experiences for different people who live in a city. And I accomplished that because of a minor character. I have a cast of characters that you see throughout the trilogy, but most of them are members of the ruling clan of the city. And so they have a certain perspective of it. And early on, I had this minor character who showed up that I initially intended as a framing device. He would come on like a George R. R. Martin style character and get us into the world and then die. And that was kind of my initial intent with this character. But as he walked on to the page, I realized, no, this guy is super useful to me as a writer because he has a completely different perspective about life in this city and shows you the seedy underbelly and the like sort of desperate life of a character who does not have wealth and power in the city. And as a result, he could get me into parts of John Loon that the main characters don't see as often, and aren't a part of. And so having a multi POV cast was really useful to understand the city and the setting better, as was just making it feel lived in. And I love talking about world building. It's kind of one of my favorite craft topics. And I often talk about how a lot of world building is just having your characters live in the world. And as they're moving through the narrative and advancing the plot, I had characters have a tense confrontation in a temple, or have a family, conversation at a sporting event. And a lot of these characters' discussions and strategy happen in their favorite family restaurant. Right. So all of those things, I hope, contribute to making the city feel like this, not just a backdrop, but like an actual character in the trilogy.
Yeah, and I like the way that you frame that. It's like the city and the scenes themselves are a framing device for world building, plot, and character. On writing excuses, the podcast, you had an intensive world building kind of course with them, where you describe it as the narrative holy trinity of world building, plot, and character, and how all these things play off of each other. And I think you can use the city itself as a framing device for the world building, depending on where you set your scenes, depending on how your characters interact with those scenes, those scenarios. And then on top of that, what are those characters doing there? And how do they perceive the world? And how do they drive the plot forward based on where they are and what they're doing? And so it's like all these three things come together and allow you to create something more rich and cohesive. And I think all four of you do a great job of setting your scenes in such ways that your characters can play off of it. There's this nice back and forth interaction between your characters and the world, such that they enhance each other. The world feels richer for what the character sees it as, and the character is richer for what the world they inhabit allows them to be. And so I really, really love how you frame that, just as the narrative holy trinity, and these three things working in conjunction.
If I can just add one thing about the city as a setting and as a character, is that oftentimes you can make your city, whether it's you're using a real city or a fictional city, thematically resonant with the story, because it would have been a very different story if I had set the Green Bone Saga in, I don't know, a rural mining town. I mean, I could have had Magic Jade in a rural mining town, but it would have been completely different. And one of the reasons why John Loon is such an integral part of the story is that one of the major themes of the trilogy is globalization and modernization, and that tension between modernity and tradition among these characters, and the culture that they are part of that legacy of these cultural traditions, and yet they are also having to deal with foreign influences that are coming into their city. And cities are so often, the focal point of influences from outside as well. So the thematic resonance of modernization and like moving into, into being part of the world and opening up and trade, all of those things are also part of the city and make that like a resonant setting.
Mm-hmm. And Jadie, in your case with Monkey Around, I'm curious how you came to decide, I want to set this story in San Francisco. But on the notion of thematic resonance, I think that's really cool. Your version of San Francisco resonates the story that you're putting on the page, in the sense that we brought up shapeshifting earlier. I did, in the sense of Berlin. Your version of San Francisco involves shapeshifting magical creatures and characters in a version of San Francisco that is riding out the monumental change and fallout from the 2008 stock market crash. And so I think it's really cool that you have this thematic resonance between your characters and your version of San Francisco. So how did you decide to set it in that city? And what was your process like in terms of fleshing out the characters and the world building and all that?
Um, well, I was reading a lot of urban fantasy at the time, a lot of woman-centered paranormal detective stories, and I just decided I wanted to write one. And as soon as I decided I wanted to write one, it was really obvious I wanted to set it in San Francisco. One of the things, and I don't get me wrong, I love urban fantasy and I love all of these series that I was reading. One of the things that bothered me about it was that, you know, the genre is very, very white, and it's very, very focused on European mythology, you know, particularly vampires, werewolves, and fae. And there's so much more mythology out there that could be tapped for urban fantasy. So I just decided to set it in my San Francisco. I mean, the San Francisco, the Bay Area that you see depicted in Monkey Around is where I live. The layers of culture and subculture that you see in there are my layers, the layers that I live in and that my friends live in and that I function in. And I wanted for once in my life to actually see my world represented in literature. It's pretty much that simple. You know, and your theme today is characters as cities. I decided to make the Bay Area an actual character, not just like a character, but an actual character. The Bay Area has a genius loci, the spirit of the place that actually at one point in the story rises up and more or less communicates with the main character. And it was something like what Fonda said earlier about how cities tell themselves what they are. I actually decided to have my, like, you know, and what I was talking about earlier with Berlin renaming its streets, you know, Berlin street renaming is one of Berlin's particular ways of telling itself what it wants to be. For me in San Francisco, it's collective action. And so I wanted to have the city rise up and choose a leader of collective action to communicate with and say, this is who I want to be, make it happen, you know. And it literally happens in the book. It's the region rises up as a spirit and says, this is what I want you to make me. And it was very important to me that this person be not just a leader of collective action, but a woman of color, an Asian American woman who is working in social justice communities, particularly in her own Asian American social justice community, because that is my experience of the Bay Area. It's my experience in San Francisco. And I think I've lost track of your question. I just went off on my own hobby horse.
No, you are on a perfect track there. You've touched on a lot of it, is sort of how you're balancing world building with character and the reasons why you set it in San Francisco, but
shapeshifters.
I love it.
You brought up the shapeshifters. I wanted to say something to that. One of the things about and this appears throughout the book, I forefront particularly the Asian American and the Latinx communities in San Francisco in the book. And one of the things about these two communities, about all communities of color, all immigrant communities especially, but all communities of color in the United States, is that there is a lot of code switching that has to happen. And for those of you who don't know what code switching means, it literally is a linguistic term that means switching from one language to another. But in the United States, it's been taken as more of a metaphorical term for switching from one language, one dialect, one subcultural idiom to another, when you're speaking two different subdialects of English. And so immigrant communities in the United States and in San Francisco especially have to code switch constantly. When they're within their community, they speak and behave one way. When they're outside of their community, they speak and behave another way. And with Asian American activism, because you're not just in your own community, your own ethnic community, you're in a broader pan-ethnic community where a lot of people from a lot of different cultural origins have come together, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Filipino, South Asian, et cetera, et cetera. And they all have different uses. They all have different languages. So when you're within your own community, you have to code switch, do a lot of code switching. So I forefronted shapeshifters in this story because these are people who in their daily lives are constantly shapeshifting, even in their human lives are constantly shapeshifting. And the two main Asian American characters are unlimited shapeshifters. They're not just stuck, restricted to one form. They could take on any form because within their own communities they have to do a lot of different types of code switching as well. So that was something that once I settled on that, I gave the entire book the theme of transformation, because I wanted to basically just you kind of lay that on top of the book, and the metaphors just write themselves. Basically, it's not super hard to create thematic resonance when you lay the right metaphor over the top of your story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's fascinating. I mean, for me, now that I live in Ecuador, that code switching thing you brought up, I think it goes beyond just America in terms of its modern connotations, because here I experienced so many different sides of Ecuador, and even within Spanish, it's like my in-laws, they're from rural Ecuador, and when we go back, the way that they speak kind of shifts a little bit, and the way that they pronounce certain things, we would call it, in North America, it's like, oh, you're from the boonies, or you're like a redneck or something like that. But it's like redneck Ecuadorians and how they speak Spanish in a different way that people in the city in Quito or Guayaquil would say, oh, you're a little more like uneducated, you know what I mean? Just by listening to how they speak. And so it's really fascinating, like these sub communities within larger communities, and how language, even though it's, a blanket term, can be so multi-layered and so distinct depending on where you are and who you're speaking with, whether it's in English or whether it's in Spanish, and all these different communities just smashing together. And Gareth, in your case, I want to toss the same question to you about how you chose to set your books in a city, but you also have fantastical races like ghouls and a disease that sweeps through the city called I can't remember what it's called, but the stone men, who are yeah, exactly. And so you have this this dynamic of interaction between people based on what form they take, whether if you have stone flesh or you're a ghoul or you're a human or whatever strata of economic status, etc. So if you want to jump off on that.
I mean, I didn't sort of consciously set out going, oh, well, put this in a city. When I started the book, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing or where I was running. So I sort of threw out lots of ideas, and then sort of took a step back and said, okay, here's how these can all fit together. Which I think is actually a fairly good way to think about writing a novel in a fictional city. Because with very, very few examples, no one sort of sits down and sort of creates a city from scratch. They're things that accrete, that evolve over time. But when you experience them, you sort of you sort of get cross sections to them. You see cities present and bits of different pasts. This building is from this particular era. This particular group arrived this city 100 years ago. These are the newcomers and so forth. So you get a sort of different slice of the city each time. So basically, when it comes to writing, sort of throwing ideas out there and then finding the sort of the most parsimonious way to put them together, fitted with city building, as opposed to starting from scratch and going, right, here's the timeline of the city from day one.
And how did that work for you in terms of giving you a platform through which you could flesh out the characters and the plot and world building and stuff like that?
Well, a lot of the time, I would write something. Oh, that's really interesting. I wonder where that goes. And I'd create a new character to basically follow that thread. So the book starts off with 3 thieves, and then I would oh, I want to go get into the politics a bit more. There's this character created who's a detective, I like have a point of view chapter from him. He can go off like talk to people at a higher social class and learn about how these cities like upper class functions, and then the university like the character's an academic, and they can go off and see that sort of stuff. It was very much sort of following interesting threads, and since then you can sort of look back and see again a different perspective of the city that you've traversed.
Yeah, it just creates a dynamic perception of what the city is like. You see it from the upper echelons all the way down to the bottom and the dregs, and I love that your process was so spontaneous. It's like after reading your books, it's interesting to apply that knowledge to, oh yeah, like this character came into the story, and I can just see your thought process is like, soon after that there was a POV chapter from their perspective, and I'm like, cool, because I really wanted to learn like what the story was like from their perspective, and that's exactly the mindset that you had.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, the whole point of a city is that there's so much there, all clashing into on like overlapping, clashing. It's fun to go exploring and find interesting nooks and crannies.
Yeah, I agree completely. And Peter, at what point did you decide you wanted to set your stories in a city? And I know a lot of your foundation came from tabletop RPG that you created. So just jump off on that and tell us how you did it.
Well, using New York City as Empire City, it's a cheat and a conceit, right? New Yorkers think that they're the center of the universe, so it's very easy to gravitate towards writing a story with that as the center of the universe. My Guardian of Empire City series is based on a series of tabletop RPGs that I've been running with my gaming group, who I've known since 1989. Fabulous people, very creative. And it's a collaborative effort because I came up with a concept of, hey, let's have a group of people who are specialists that can solve crimes strange and unusual by any means necessary. And we'll throw in urban fantasy, and we'll throw in science fiction, and we'll throw in fantasy and a lot of bad jokes, and we'll mesh that all together into what eventually became completed games that I then took those games and said, hey, let's novelize those. So I did. And, the characters, most of the characters in the story are actually characters or mirror images of the characters that some of my players played, with the exception of the lead character who I came up with myself. And so, I wanted to have a setting that was both familiar and unfamiliar. It's a near future New York, which it's partly a conceit because by using New York City, I don't have to create a city. It's already there. What I can do is take the foundation of what's there and then change it and go, what if? What if this happened? What if this neighborhood's changed? Why did this neighborhood change? Who lives in this neighborhood? Ooh, maybe it's stayed the same over the years, but what are the subtle influences? And you get to play with that. And so the sandbox becomes very broad and very approachable. So again, using New York City, I focused on in the first book, I focused on Manhattan for the main thrust of the story, but the lead character is from an area called Brighton Beach, because I wanted to bring in an aspect of the character that he's half Jewish, and I don't see, in reading a lot of urban fantasy, I don't see Judaism really show up much in these stories, and that's okay. It's just hasn't been there. But I wanted to bring my own slant to it. I'm a Jewish family. In fact, my son a year ago today was bar mitzvahed. I got another one coming up in November. And I wanted to add that bit of cultural difference and distinction to my stories, in addition to, like what Jadie said. I mean, the preponderance of the stories that I read as well, it's very Euro mythology focused. It's mostly white, and to be fair, my lead characters are white, but have their distinctions as well. Just try to create a bigger world and remind people that there is a greater and bigger world out there, to perhaps shed some light on some bits of culture that you don't normally read about or don't normally see. And that becomes even more apparent in the sequel pieces of 8. New York is wonderful because it's so big and so sprawling that you go. I can go to familiar areas and then change them, and use street names to lend the familiarity to it, to give it a sense of place and history, but then change it and say, oh, well, what used to be here, the old brownstones and up and comers and art decor and whatever, is now run down and economically depressed. Whereas I can flip that and take economically depressed areas and change them and do whatever I want with it to show a future that is familiar and yet different.
Yeah, I like that. And at the same time, since you are setting this in a city that exists, Jadie, I'll get your opinion on this afterwards. Were there any pitfalls that you were aware of or tried to avoid, because you are representing your version of this city, and as opposed to presenting what could be called like a generalization of New York City, or in Jadie's case, a generalization of San Francisco?
Well, the challenge is exactly that, trying not to paint too pale a picture. And just, if I'm going to gloss over something, I gotta give it enough love to not insult it, to take the remnants of whatever a neighborhood used to be, say whether it's 21st century or 22nd century, 23rd, whatever, and give it its due, but not to the extent that it doesn't sound like I know what I'm writing about. Right? The lead character is a homicide detective. It allows, by having that badge, it allows him to get into relatively anywhere. So highbrow neighborhoods, lowbrow neighborhoods, and everything in between. I wanted not to insult the character of New Yorkers and New York, for sure. I wanted, when you read my stories, I want you to feel like you're in New York, and you can see it, and you can smell it, and you can hear it, and you can taste it, and give it, like I said earlier, give it its fair due. Some of the challenges are, some of it just falls under research, making sure I did my own homework of reading about a particular neighborhood or reading about a particular industry or something, and having enough familiarity with it to be able to write about it so it sounds authentic. In our critique sessions, I talk about authenticity, where you want to be able to write and thus read something that is plausible and real, and has complexity and depth to it, and again, not to insult anyone or anything, as best as I can.
Yeah, and Jadie, in your case with San Francisco, you touched on this a little bit before about evoking your San Francisco experience, like how you've lived it, and much like Peter's detective, your main character is a shapeshifter and can thus access so many different places within San Francisco that the majority of people would never be able to get to. So for you, how did you straddle that line between evoking your version of San Francisco and your experiences, but at the same time not painting too broad a brush?
I think that wasn't my difficulty. As long as I was able to focus on, I was able to primarily focus on my own experience of the city, and that made it particular enough. But it is very, very difficult to build an urban fantasy world with hidden magic as opposed to like a Patricia Briggs world where magic is open and everybody knows about it, or Alona Andrews or what have you. It's very hard to build an urban fantasy world with hidden magic without a criminal underground that the magical creatures, that the supernatural is heavily involved in, because it's just completely illogical that there wouldn't be a human criminal underground that is interwoven with the magical creatures. Otherwise, keeping it secret wouldn't work. How would you get your stuff? How would you live? How would you function? It's just not possible. So I knew I wanted to have the criminal underground, organized crime gangs in the story from the jump, partly because of that simple logistical problem, but also because it is one of the pitfalls of immigrant communities. But the moment you recognize that, you bring that into your story, you're walking a very fine line between stereotype and reality. And that was where a lot of my revision was focused, was like, just tweak things constantly away from stereotypes, constantly away from portraying people as simple thugs, portraying people as simple criminals, and just really digging into, why do these people join gangs? Why do these people become part of organized crime? What is the appeal of that? Not just for supernatural creatures, but also for humans. And I hope I got it right, but that was a really difficult one.
No, I can imagine. And Gareth and Fonda, you both have set your stories in completely fictional worlds. Fonda, I think I've heard you touch on this before. I can't remember if we spoke about it back in November, but how you created this world and John Loon and everything surrounding it, with the intention of it not being so easily definable as this Asian culture or that Asian culture, et cetera, et cetera. So for you, when creating this fictional world, what kind of flexibility did that offer you in terms of giving the setting its own unique character, but also the citizens that are occupying it, and at the same time freeing you up from some of the pitfalls of focusing too intently on one specific culture as your basis?
Well, the double-edged sword of creating your city to be entirely fictional is, on the plus side, you are not beholden to facts and real life and real people. On the downside, now you have to make all that stuff up. So you've got more work on one hand and less work on the other, and so it's kind of a wash. But I very much wanted this city to be a product of its culture, its origin, and its geography, right? So it's the capital city of an island nation, and that very much defines its character. It has this long history of having been relatively isolated, and now just sort of in the modern era, having to deal with a great deal of growth and modernization and international trade. It is also very much defined by the magic resource that I have in this world, which is the magic jade. And that was one reason why I actually tossed around the idea of setting the story in an existing AU version of a city in our world. Like, I could have tried to set this story in an alternate Tokyo or alternate San Francisco, and had magic jade in that world, but there would have been so many limitations because the city would have developed completely differently if there was a magic resource. And then I was starting to bend what would bend reality in a way that I ended up deciding, I'm just gonna start from the studs and bare bones of what do I know about this place geographically, and kind of the history of it and the cultural influence, and the type of people who live there, and build up from there. And exactly as you said, I needed to code it as East Asian without making it recognizable as any one place in our real world. And so that led to specific world building choices. So that, when I describe a meal that you have when you go to a night market, and you buy something from a food vendor there, you need to be like, wow, this is an Asian night market, and this is the sort of food that I would get if I was there. But it's not distinguishable as, it's not sushi. It's not ramen. It's not dim sum. It's not any one of those culturally specific foods. But it still cues you into the setting, into the cultural inspirations.
Yeah, I like that. It's like, no, they're dumplings. It's not dim sum. Don't worry. Like these are steamed buns, or this is like a sushi roll or something like that. But it's very it's very convincing what you've created just because of the thought that you've put behind it. All of you have put so much thought. And Gareth, I want to get your take on this as well, just from the perspective of a secondary world. But regardless of whether you're writing an our world or a secondary world, you have to put in the thought and intention of how you want this to be portrayed, because otherwise you're going to contradict yourself and the reader's going to get confused, or there's going to be, in the case of a secondary world, there's going to be too many parallels between this world and ours that it feels washed down. It feels watered down in terms of its believability as its own unique thing. And Gareth, what was your approach when you were creating Guerdon? I think I pronounced that right.
Yeah, well, it's a real word, but it sounds like London, which was what I really liked about it. No, I mean, the city started out as basically, like, the geography of it is pretty much based on Cork, where I live. Then it's got like the history, like the sort of historical feel of London, with many, many, many layers of events and sort of waxing away in importance, and then the sort of the architecture and sort of verticality of Edinburgh, which are also I know fairly well. But what I really wanted when writing was basically the sort of the complexity of the city, in that I was doing a story about active gods, these supernatural powers that are very much impacting on human life. And what I needed then was this a relatively realistic city that could be deformed by the supernatural. And cities are great for that, because cities have so many sort of needs. City has to be fed, there has to be sewers, there has to be government, there has to be organizations. They're ecosystems, and you sort of take this urban ecosystem and you slam in this god of war, or demonic black iron gods, and see how it changes and how it sort of reflows. So it was like talking about Potsdamplatz, the sort of the traffic flowing around all the construction. Similarly, you take this divine influence. How does the city move around that?
Yeah, and in your case, the city itself is literally inhabited by gods. They've had a hand in manipulating the layout. You're driving around Potsdamer Platz and the traffic is flowing based on whatever is happening in that particular day. But in your case, instead of the fallout of war, it's the fallout of supernatural gods. Yeah.
I mean, that was just me having great fun with sort of literalizing metaphors, and instead of the city being at war, you have the god of war showing up and blowing things up.
And it makes for more fun too. Action packed. God comes and just throws shit off balance. And I want to sort of wind this down and ask you. We've been talking a lot about cities and world building and how that intersects with characters and plot and things like that. But if you could boil down some practical advice for listeners, viewers who are actively writing themselves or thinking about writing stories that are set in cities. So Peter, we'll start with you if you have some advice for viewers and listeners.
Write what you know, research what you don't know, draw upon your creativity, and don't be afraid. Just don't be afraid. Just write. Because if you don't write, you've got nothing. And it's you have a gift. Express it. Read everything. Read what you can. If you want to write urban fantasy, read romance too. Read everything, because the influences around you, especially in today's world, where there are thousands of brilliant authors out there, traditionally published, self-published, that have stories that you can learn from. But be yourself, be true to yourself, and just write on.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, that's a good point. Just like if you just let it come out of you and you write and you let it happen naturally, revision is where you can fix your errors, because errors are guaranteed as a writer. But that's what revision is for. Jadie brought it up earlier. She went back and revised her book in order to make her representation of San Francisco and the gang and criminal element of that city as believable as possible, but also a fair representation. So it's like you can go back and fix whatever shit you mess up along the way, but just have fun with it and just let it spill out naturally, you know? Fonda, do you have some advice for aspiring writers or people who are working on stuff?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, Peter put it really well, and I'll just bounce off of it and say that, write the story that you're meant to write. Don't write like what you think either the you should be writing or the market is telling you to write. Like if you think about what everyone on this panel has been saying, they've, all brought something of their own experience, even if they're working in a very working in an established genre like urban fantasy with a city that millions of people live in and multiple more millions of people already know, like San Francisco, for example. You're bringing something of yourself to that story, and like, what are you doing that is sort of really personal and important to you, that makes you the right person to write this story and to bring your own heart into it. Because for every single writer who's out there now currently working on a manuscript, you're going to have to live with this story for a long time. Like, not just the writing process, but then the publishing process and the marketing and publicity process. And you've got to live with the story for 1 to 3 years, right? And especially, and more if you're writing speculative fiction, you've got a series planned. So just I feel like if you're writing a city as well, your city, we talked about the city being a character. I think every writer loves their characters, even the ones that are that very questionable or despicable characters. Like, I love all those characters because I've created them, and I think you also have to love the world, and if you are working in an urban setting, you have to kind of have that sort of deep affection for the world that you're working in.
Yeah, and you got to love the process too, because if you're in love with the characters and the world that you're creating, it's going to give you more motivation to just push through what is not an easy thing, which is writing a book. And I Fonda, you and I talked about this before, but it's like saying goodbye to John Loon and the characters of the Green Bone Saga and that world and everything. When you finish this trilogy, you there's a part of you that actively misses them and has deep affection for them. And I think whatever you create, if you have deep affection for it and you miss it, that can make you think at the end of the day, shit, that was really worth it. Like, I loved doing that and building that and putting it out into the world. And now other people have the opportunity to love it and devour it and everything like that. Gareth, what about you? If you have some practical advice for the listeners and viewers out there.
Practical advice. There's the fantastic William Gibson quote, like the street finds its own uses for things. Because like you've like, so many different sort of groups in a city, any plot element to introduce is going to be sort of picked up and used by different people, or they're going to find their own ways of interacting with it. So if you sort of introduce things, see what other levels and parts of the city that could affect. So if you introduce a new fictional concept, see what that goes in the city. Let's sort of go walking on the streets and turn some corners and see how it's used there.
Yeah. And it's much like our individual experiences, subjective experiences with the city. What you implement into your world will be used in different ways based on the subjective experience of the characters that inhabit it, which is why, you know, Fonda was mentioning about having multiple POVs. Gareth, you as well. I think it's really important that you take the technologies or magic or what have you that you implement into your world and make it uh make it as integrated as possible, but then give yourself the opportunities to make it as believable as possible for readers who will then pick up your book. Because otherwise it's like, oh, I have this cool thing and it's just fucking throwaway garbage because nobody talks about it, nobody uses it, nobody shows that it's a real living aspect of this world. And Jadie, we'll close out with you if you have some advice for listeners and viewers.
Location scouting. I've been making TikTok videos actually about the location scouting I'm doing for the second Maya McQueen novel, the second Monkey novel. And I highly recommend it if you're writing about a city that you know or that you live in, that you don't just rely on your past experiences, but that you go to the locations of the scenes. And if you're writing about a secondary world city that you're making up out of whole cloth, go to places that are that have similar functions to the locations that you're trying to build, so that you can get a 5 cents, not just a 5 cents, you know, a 9 cents sense impression of what the place is like, what it looks like, smells like, tastes like, feels like, and sounds like, and so that you're not relying when you do an actual location scout, all of your senses and all your attention is going to be turned on the location, especially anyway. Whereas when you rely on your memory, you're only going to rely on the things that you focused on when you were there last. And unfortunately, we go through, you know, cities are such a full sensory experience, and so much sensory overwhelm that we shut the senses off as we go through our everyday lives. And so we shut so much of the city out. So you have to actually go through a process of opening those back up to let the things in that you need to shut out to get through your day. And you need those things so as not to have that sort of Harold in the Purple Crayon impression where you only draw in the things that you need in that moment and the rest of the world is blank. So yeah, 5 senses, do your location scouting, even if you're building a completely made up city.
And go into it with intentionality. Like you said, it's like you're purposefully opening up your senses in order to get a broader feeling of what is going on around you. But if you go into it thinking like, oh, I'm only going to include smells and taste, and then therefore you're just focusing on food, it's like, okay, that's cool. But at the same time, you know, what's going on around? Who's talking? What's the setting like? What's the auditory vibe of this place? It's like, you know, Peter and I in our writing critique group, we talk a lot about this in terms of sensory information and description and how that comes through and creates a sense of immersion for the reader. And I think that is so important. It's like you got to have balance. You can't just, you know, I've read books where so much of the sensory description is just sight or sound or smell, but then what the hell is your character tasting? Or, you know, in the sense of a city like Boston where you're on the seaside, you taste the salt on your mouth, you taste the car exhaust because it's just this full body interaction, but you can't leave that stuff out, or it just kind of falls a little bit flat or feels less believable than it really could. To close out, I would like all of you to share some recommendations. It could be a book, movie, what have you, that represents a city in a pure and powerful way. So we'll start with Fonda.
Wow, to put me on the spot.
Always.
Let's see, the ones that jump to mind for me, 2 of them jump to mind for me immediately when we talk about cities. One is Lies of Loch Glamora by Scott Lynch. The city of Camor there is a fictional city, a fantasy world but it's so richly realized, and sort of the dark underbelly and the criminal elements of that city and the districts have their characters to them, and that sort of division between the rich and the powerful and the very desperate and poor, and all the sketchy things that happen. So that city stands out to me. And then when we're talking about real cities, I think Harry Dresden's Chicago jumps to mind for me. As that I will always associate Dresden with Chicago.
And that's Jim Butcher's Dresden Files series. Fantastic. I love those books so much. Cool. And Peter, what about you? You got some recommendations?
For Real City, Michael Connelly's Harry Bosch. It's Los Angeles. He lives and breathes it, even though he's from Florida. The way Bosch moves about that city and the way that it's described, and the very, in parts, grimy, dirty, because he's a homicide detective, seeing the underbelly of the neighborhoods and whatnot, it just really, really stands out and does help inform some of what I've been writing about. From a fantasy standpoint, there's a couple of them. I'm actually about to finish the fourth book in Douglas Lumsden's Alexander Sutherland PI series. It's urban fantasy. It takes place in a fictional California, if you will. It's heavily influenced with South American and Native American mythology. Excellent description of his city that seems to be an amalgamation of San Francisco and perhaps parts of Southern California as well. So you really can taste and feel and see the city. And then way out fantasy, T.A. Bruno's The Song of Chimerias series. It's science fiction. And Tom's, first of all, just a really great guy, super nice guy. And his other world, where humans left Earth and they've transplanted to this other planet, is so full of life and color and majesty. And how he describes it is really visceral and visual and cinematic. I think he does a really nice job with that.
Cool, thank you. And Jadie, what about you? Some recommendations?
So two for actual cities. One is I was actually thinking about, when Peter was talking about New York City, I was thinking about, like, none of us are really talking about New York City. Like, even Peter didn't really get into rhapsodizing about New York City the way that we did about other cities. And it's because it is so overexposed as a city. And so I want to recommend N.K. Jemison's The City We Became, which is a very unusual urban fantasy about New York City and the five boroughs, where the five boroughs literally talk about city as a character. In this world, actual cities become literally embodied in a person. And New York City, because it's five boroughs, becomes embodied in five people, plus another one. And that's fantastic. And then P. Jelly Clark's The Black God's Drums. It's a novella, so it doesn't have a lot of space for world building, but it does a really great job with New Orleans in a very, very small space. And then, of course, for secondary world cities, Fonda Lee's Jade or Green Bone Saga, Jade City, and all of that is the best. Right now, it is just the best. I cannot stop talking about this series.
Seconded, absolutely.
Yes, you have to read it. Have to read it. Yeah.
Yep, I'm on. I haven't started book 3 yet, but poor Adrian had to put up with me because he's like, "Oh yeah, you're going to be on this podcast, and it'll be Gareth and Jadie and Fonda Lee." And I stopped for a second and said, "Wait a minute, I've read those books." Oh, this is fantastic. No, Jadie's absolutely right.
It's like, oh,
fantastic,
shit,
fantastic. Yep.
Guys, my ears are burning. I'm blushing.
And Gareth, what about some recommendations from you?
It's super on theme, but China Meeble, The City and the City.
Yeah,
Again, talking about
excellent book.
Perceptions of cities, and Talo Calvino's Invisible Cities again, which seems like sort of sketching out ideas of city in like literally one page. And I probably can't recommend a book I haven't read yet, but I'm going to make another attempt, I think my third attempt now, on Alan Moore's Jerusalem, but Northampton, which is apparently fantastic, but very, very dense. I've not been in the right headspace.
It's a long book too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You took one of mine, Gareth, with Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. Fantastic. If anyone is writing and wants to understand how you can capture a city in a page, just go read that book. It's dozens of little vignettes about a fictional Marco Polo telling Kublai Khan of his travels to different places, and Italo Calvino just spins this beautiful, fantastical web of all these different cities, and is amazing. And it's also kind of like a play on the whole Marco Polo travelogue genre. So it's really fantastic. One for me that's just so burned into my brain is Jeff Vandermeer's Ambergris trilogy. And the City of Ambergris, so there's 3 books. There's The City of Saints and Madmen, Finch, and Shriek.
Yeah.
And all 3 of them just create this beautiful tapestry of what this mushroom infested city is like. And Peter knows me well. It's just a mushroom smorgasbord. It's beautiful. And
that is so you, man. That is so you. Adrian is writing his own novel, and it's, first of all, it's brilliant from what I've read so far. And it infuses, talk about somebody who is able to, and he didn't pay me, well, at least the check hasn't cleared yet. Talk about somebody who can portray all of the senses and really get you invested in the characters and the point of view. Adrian has done a phenomenal job so far.
Thank you, man. Thank you. And there's tons of mushrooms. It's a mushroom.
There are.
Yeah, it's.
I'm just delighted that there's another mushroom aficionado, because I'm the only one in my family who likes mushrooms.
Really?
And it's yeah.
Fort Salem?
No, I've never heard of that.
Or Star Trek Discovery. Okay. Apparently, a lot of people are getting into mycelium these days, mushrooms.
Yeah.
Yep.
But Star Trek Discovery has a mushroom drive, spaceship driven by mushrooms. And
I heard about that. It's like a mycelium warp drive.
Has mushroom magic.
Oh, hell yes.
Yeah, mushroom magic. Very powerful mushroom magic. So check that.
Damn, I'm writing my book at the right time. There's like all kinds of mushroom love out there.
And Mexican Gothic is another good book for if you want to have high mycological themes. No.
Just as soon as we close out, things get really psychedelic. So cool. Well, Fonda, Gareth, Peter, Jadie, thank you all so much for joining me and exploring the fascinating world of cities. If you could please share with viewers and listeners where they can find you on social media, where they can find your work. Gareth, we'll start with you.
I'm GarethHanrahan.com, or just Mytholder on Twitter is where you'll find me.
Cool. And where can people find your work?
In bookstores or game shops. The Background Legacy is out through Orbit Books. Most role-playing stuff these days is Brain Press.
Awesome. And Fonda, what about you?
You can find my books pretty much wherever books are normally sold, and you can find me online. My website is fondalee.com. I'm on Instagram at fonda.lee and Twitter at fondajlee.
Perfect. And Jadie?
My website is clairelight.com. That's CLAIRELIGHT.org. Sorry, .org. And I am at SEELIGHT on Twitter. see light.
Fantastic. And you can find Monkey around everywhere there are books. I assume everyone's books are available everywhere.
Books available in
And
bookstores.
and Peter, my friend, where can people find you?
They can find me sitting right here most days, but Twitter at Althazir, ALTHAZYR. My website is peterhartog.com, HARTOG. I have product placement. Anyway, and I can be found on Amazon. Just look my name up and you might find me, hopefully.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for being here. I had a great time. Been looking forward to this discussion topic for months and months and months, so I appreciate you joining me.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Adrian. This was
Adrian.
awesome.
Thank you.